Hello everybody and welcome back to the Patreon Drydock for the month of June. This is the second part, so we have a few more questions to go on. Probably won't last quite as long as the first one, but that is generally the way of things. So let's get on with the next set of questions, shall we? Nathan P. Gillespie asks, what are your thoughts on the career of Admiral George Rodney, especially the criticisms about prize money chasing? Well, generally speaking, Admiral Rodney, well, even before he was an admiral, seems to have had a particular skill in command and control and tactical leadership in battle. So he was certainly one of Britain's more accomplished admirals. Now, as far as the criticisms about prize money chasing are concerned, there's a certain validity to them. Some instances are a little bit overblown, but at the same time, his attitude towards preferring to go over prize money in the face of potentially some other, perhaps more pressing concerns, was not unique to the Royal Navy. It wasn't the majority, so he was in a minority with quite how aggressively he went after it, but he wasn't the only one who did it. But he was perhaps one of the most famous Royal Navy admirals who did so, and therefore, obviously, with fame comes more critical examination of his actions. Now, obviously, going after prize money to the detriment of your orders and to the detriment of the service is not a good thing, so I'm not trying to excuse it, but I am perhaps going to provide a little bit of an explanation. So, whereas a number of Royal Navy officers would, certainly at admiral rank, came from relatively privileged backgrounds where their fortune at sea could affect how much luxury they had ashore, but would not affect the fact that they had luxury ashore, if you see what I mean. So they had either independently inherited wealth or some other role or just land, etc., possessions back ashore, which was separate from their role in the Royal Navy. Rodney, although he had a pedigreed background, did not come from money. He started out relatively poor, and therefore, when he was working his way up, getting some really nice prizes early on gave him a substantial amount of cash. Admittedly, he did waste a bunch of it later on, but essentially, you're looking at a time period where there is no social safety net. There is none of the guarantees, the pensions, retirement bonuses, etc., that you'd expect these days. And it was entirely possible to be stuck on half pay should peace come about and your services no longer be required. So overall, for someone in his position who perhaps definitely didn't want to return to the relative poverty he'd started out in, you can understand why he might be a little bit obsessed with grabbing every single bit of ready cash he could get his hands on as essentially insurance against a rainy day, and to guarantee the legacy of both him and his children, because no one else was going to look out for his financial interests. Now, towards the end of his career, he did get voted a pension, and a relatively substantial one at that, but of course that wasn't guaranteed for most of his career. He had to do something really spectacular to get that. And so, as I say, without excusing some of his more egregious actions in regard to chasing prize money, in a situation back then where the only way to guarantee that you and your family would have money was to quite literally seize it yourself, it's a little bit understandable as to why he sometimes got carried away. US Navy Sailor asks, after the Pearl Harbour attack, various standard-class battleships were sent to Puget Sound for repairs and radar and fire control systems for the main battery installed. How complicated was this? I'm assuming it was installing the fire control systems, making it so the servo inputs from the fire control systems could be switched from rangefinders through the fire control systems, through several barrel switches into the fire control computers, from there to the turrets, and all these systems were generally the same, and then you had to do the battery alignment. But was there something more that had to be done, or is that about it? Well, complexity depended on the degree of work that was being done. So some ships, like, say, the Maryland, that had essentially escaped unscathed compared to some other vessels, could be quickly shoved in, given a basic radar fit and a short anti-aircraft refit, and sent back out again. Whereas a ship like West Virginia, which was almost being rebuilt from scratch in some ways, had much more extensive work done. Full 5-inch 38 secondary batteries, brand new fire control systems and radar, although a lot of the standards had fire control systems nicked off, or, well, not nicked, but taken off of the Cleveland class cruisers that were being refitted to Independence class aircraft carriers, rather than the full-scale systems you might find on a North Carolina, South Dakota, or Iowa. But regardless, the complexity, once you take into account those variations, it was both easy and difficult, which is really not helpful, I know, but hopefully you'll understand when I explain a bit more. So these ships already had fire control systems for their main guns, for their secondary battery, etc. So there were cable paths, etc., from rangefinder positions up top down to the plotting room and back up to the guns. But what you had to do was replace the older systems with the newer, much more complex systems, and that obviously needed more power and sometimes more space down in the plotting room. And of course, that meant new and more cabling going up and down. And of course, in some cases, you would also have to leave some of the old cabling in there, because you'd still want your old optical systems as backups, in at least some of them. And once that's all in place, on the one hand, by the time they're refitting the standards in 42-43, they have plenty of experience in installing a modern electronic fire control system in the fast battleships that have already been constructed or are under construction. So they kind of know what they're doing, but also obviously they're having to thread through existing rather than building from new and threading as they go. The actual mechanics of making sure that servos were relaying the information correctly was relatively easy to configure. The bigger issue, as I said, was that they were in large part borrowing substantial amounts of systems from cruisers. So once you'd got those systems in place, you then had to calibrate or check the recalibration if it had already been done ashore, because obviously a fire control system that was originally designed to fire 6-inch guns and is now having to fire 14 or 16-inch guns needs a complete realignment to make sure that it will actually direct the guns where they need to go. That is probably the far more complicated bit, because you can technically re-engineer the whole thing relatively easily for a relative value of easy, but once it's installed, you've got to make sure that the theory matches up with the practicality, because even the smallest error could result in consistent misses. Chief Eyeroll asks, during World War II, did American dive bomber doctrine change in regard to the attack profile and bomb release height? Were there changes in how the dive bombers were coordinated with other aircraft types as the numbers of planes involved increased? Now, obviously, people like Chris from Military Aviation History or Rex from Rex's Hangar will be able to answer these aircraft-based questions in a lot more detail. But in terms of coordination, yes, there were changes as to how the dive bombers were coordinated, because, well, take, for example, the Battle of Midway. At that point, the dive bombers are pretty much sent off on their own. They're not even combined between carriers. It's, right, here's the dive bomber squadron from Enterprise, here's the dive bomber squadron from Yorktown. Off you go, find a target, hit it if you can, fantastic, great, come back if you're able. Obviously, as the war went on, you start to integrate more direct fighter support into dive bomber missions. So by the time of the Guadalcanal carrier battles, you see that, Wildcats are actually being specifically dedicated to keeping the dive bombers safe. That requires an upgrade in coordination, because that means you've got to launch the dive bomber squadron, and they can't just go swanning off into the sunset. They've got to hang around, wait for the fighters to be available, or vice versa. And then they've got to coordinate speed and direction between the two squadrons so they kind of stick together. And then as you get to the latter stages of the war, when you have the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, etc., you're now talking about multiple dive bomber squadrons from multiple carriers with escorts, all being sent off at specific targets in a somewhat more coordinated fashion than, oh, well, this carrier's launched its strike, well, I guess we'll send our strike off 10 minutes afterwards or whatever. So, of course, that needs a whole load of coordination, not just to avoid confusion and potentially streams of dive bombers running into each other, but also once you get to the target, you've actually got to organise a series of attacks, because if you have 150 dive bombers all show up in roughly the same time period and they all decide to mob the single biggest target present, that's going to lead to more mid-air collisions and losses to that kind of stuff than the Japanese anti-aircraft guns could ever hope to do, and probably mean most of your bombs will miss. So you need to go, okay, right, attack element from the Shangri-La is going to go in first, then the attack element from Lexington's going to go in, and then the attack element from Enterprise is going to go in. And obviously you need to work out where everybody is, because if the Shangri-La element is right at the back, it's rather dumb to send them in first. You want to send one of the formations that's close to the front in first. And you even have to work out the exit vectors. So, okay, well, we're going to attack from, let's say, the bow. We're going to go bow on, and obviously we're going to pull out going across the stern. Or it might be, well, regardless of what the ship's alignment is, we're going to attack from 160 degrees and we're going to exit via 300 degrees bearing, again, to avoid collisions and confusion and that kind of thing. Especially if you've got strafing fighters and torpedo bombers at lower levels, you don't want to end up diving into their attack stream. Now, as regards attack profile and bomb release height, obviously there are multiple different attack profiles that a dive bomber could engage in. You could do a glide bomb, a skip bomb, or the more traditional diving attack. But in terms of bomb release height, there were usually three main factors that dictated what release height you would use, and these factors could change on a mission by mission basis. So as far as I'm aware, there wasn't really a general trend one way or the other across the war. It was just what was available at the time. So the first thing was, how accurate do you want to be versus how likely do you want to be shot? Because you could drop a bomb from, say, 2,500, 3,000 feet, and you'd have a chance to pull out that, still would leave you above the general accurate level of fire for Japanese light and medium anti-aircraft guns. But if you drop from 2,500 feet, there's a reasonable chance that bomb might miss. If you descend to 800 or 1,000 feet before you release the bomb, there's a much greater chance that bomb might hit, but a much greater chance you might be shot at. So how well defended the target is and how vital it is could affect your release height. Another factor would be, what kind of bomb are you carrying? Because if you're carrying a general purpose bomb, it doesn't really matter what height you release it at. If it hits, it's just going to go boom. Whereas if you're carrying an armor-piercing bomb, there are certain heights below which you can't really release an armor-piercing bomb, because when you drop it, it accelerates, and armor-piercing bombs need a certain amount of speed in order to, do the penetration that is the whole point of them. And so there are altitude regimens for specific types of armor-piercing bomb where the bomb has to be released ideally below a certain altitude, so in order to ensure accuracy, but above a certain altitude in order to ensure that they hit hard enough. And, for example, when you look at the raids on Tirpitz with Barracudas, some of them with a new 1,600-pound armor-piercing bomb, they actually release their bombs too low, so the bombs don't get a chance to build up enough speed, so their armor penetration isn't as good as it could have been. And a final factor, which is somewhat related to the first one, is what kind of target are you bombing? Because if you're going after a stationary airfield or a Japanese shore emplacement and you've got yourself nicely lined up at 2,500 feet, you might as well let the bombs go, because that target ain't moving. So if you've got a good alignment, chances are you're probably going to hit. Whereas if you're going after a fast-moving destroyer that's twisting and turning like a snake in the grass, a 2,500 foot release, they're probably going to be able to dodge. So at that point, you would probably want to try and carry your attack lower. And obviously this factors in with also how much defense the target is putting up as well. But, a big, slow ship that perhaps has its rudder jammed and is turning in a predictable circle, you might be more comfortable releasing higher up, whereas the smaller, the faster, the more agile, the more evasive the ship is, the lower down you might want to go. Lord Quack King of the Ducks asks, I've read in some places that at the Battle of Leyte Gulf the US Navy had more ships committed than the Japanese had aircraft available. Is this true, and what percentage of the US Pacific Fleet was committed to battle versus the percentage still out doing other things elsewhere? Well, I think a lot of it is going to depend on how you quantify stuff. Are you quantifying how many ships the US Navy has available as in serious surface combatants, or are you including every single Higgins boat in that equation? And on the Japanese side, are you just including the aircraft available on the decoy force at the Battle of Cape Engano, or are you including every aircraft the Japanese tried to throw into the general battle equation? Because if you just use the aircraft available for the decoy force of Cape Engano, that's just under 120 aircraft. At which point, if you add up everything destroyer escort size and larger that was involved in Surigao Strait, Samar, and Battle of Cape Engano, then yes, at that point, the Americans have more ships available than the Japanese. But even if you add up all ships available, including those in the amphibious landing force, and compare them just to the number of Japanese aircraft shot down over the course of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, that number of Japanese aircraft vastly exceeds the number of ships available. Not by orders of magnitude, but there are still more Japanese aircraft around than there are ships. As for how much of the US Navy was present, it depends hugely on what element you're looking at of the US Navy. So, for example, if you take fast battleships, basically almost every single American fast battleship was present. You've got Iowa, New Jersey, South Dakota, Massachusetts, Alabama, and Washington. So that's 6 fast battleships. Now, you might think, well, hang on a minute, there's Wisconsin, Missouri, North Carolina herself, and Indiana. But you've got to remember that Wisconsin and Missouri have only just been commissioned. They're not doing anything else. They're on their way to the Pacific Theater. So they don't really count as active elsewhere. Indiana has engine problems and is on her way back to Pearl Harbour at the time, and North Carolina is under refit. So, of the US fast battleships that aren't present at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, none of them are actually on duty doing other operations in the Pacific. 2 of them are on their way, and 2 of them are either in refit or on their way to refit. So at that point, the entire active fast battleship strength of the US Navy is present. Conversely, when you look at the slower battleships, the old ones, well, Arkansas, Texas, New York, Idaho, Colorado, New Mexico, etc., all of these, Nevada, these ships are off doing other things, not even necessarily in the Pacific. Some of them were present off D-Day, some of them are then present off the landings in the south of France, etc., and so on. So they are off doing other missions. So there are 6 old standards at Leyte Gulf, but that represents maybe around about half the total strength, and a reasonable number of the remaining strength is off doing other things. And it tends to scale as you head on downwards. So there's a reasonable number of American fleet carriers, but there are other fleet carriers off doing other things, or indeed in refit or shuttling back and forth, either going to refit or coming from it. But there are active American Essex-class carriers out there in the Pacific that aren't at Leyte Gulf. And then obviously once you get down to the cruisers, the destroyers, the escort carriers, a small percentage of, well below 50% of the active carriers and destroyers and cruisers are present at Leyte Gulf, because there are many, many, many more of them, and thus they're off doing other things. So working out the percentage of the US Pacific Fleet committed to that battle is a little bit difficult, because, as I say, it basically depends on what type of ship are you looking at. F-19A Ghost Rider asks, I've been reading Robert K. Massey's Dreadnought and shaking my head at the culture of polish over everything in the late Victorian period Royal Navy, when an operational ship's quality was determined primarily by how nice it looked, as opposed to things like operational efficiency and gunnery, not to mention the very top-heavy leadership culture. Within the period this channel covers, i.e. up to 1950, would you consider this the worst period for the Royal Navy in terms of professional capability, or would another period fit that definition more? As bad as some of the worst excesses of the late 19th century Victorian Navy could get, I don't think it was the worst period for the Royal Navy, in part because once you had people like Scott and Fisher show up, most of the officers demonstrated they were quite able to very quickly turn around to full operational efficiency, guns and shooting and everything. And it doesn't seem to have had a massive adverse impact on the generation of admirals who were coming after them, i.e. the ones who grew up in their careers in those circumstances. Because you've got to remember, people like Jellicoe and Sturdy were midshipmen, lieutenants, captains, etc. during that period. And yet by the First World War, they were entirely capable of fighting in a manner that actually they needed to. Now, that's obviously not to say that there weren't some fairly poor holdovers from that time period. There were, even by the First World War. But as a whole, it was a divergence off into, if you like, an indulgence. But at its core, the Royal Navy remained a relatively professional force. As I said, pretty much evidenced by the fact they were able to switch back into operational war mode pretty quickly. I would say if you're looking for the worst period of the Royal Navy, when it is formally the Royal Navy, i.e. it is the main seagoing arm of state power, as opposed to the late Tudor period where it's a small royal force augmented by lots of private vessels, then I would actually say the worst period is probably the early half of the 18th century. And the reason I say that is because by that stage, the Navy has grown big enough to be a serious portion of a major power's state strategy. So it is very important to state survival. But it is in the process of being strangled by budgetary restraints. You have the initial form of ship ratings, which are designed to keep ships small and economical, not to actually necessarily design particularly good ships. This is the time period which will eventually end up sending 50-gunner and 64-gunner ships up against French 74-gunners for an uncomfortably long period of time. And on top of all this, unlike the latter part of the 19th century, this actually leads to a bit of a malaise setting in the Royal Navy's crews all the way up to command level. Because say what you will about the late 19th century Royal Navy, if they'd been told, hang on a minute, you know what, look guys, we're going to have to go and fight someone, they would actually fight. You can make an argument as to how effective some of the ships may be in the actual fight, but you wouldn't be able to fault them for not trying. Whereas in the 1730s, 1740s especially, and going into things like the War of Jenkins' Ear, you see entire fleet battles where good chunks of the Royal Navy's capital ships just don't support their admiral. They show up to the battle, they're all in a battle line, but when the admiral says, look, we're going into the enemy line, 2/3 of the fleet just sits there and goes, nah, I'm staying here. Partly because I don't trust your tactics, which is a terrible thing for a subordinate commander to do. There's having misgivings about your admiral's tactics, but not trusting them and trusting yourself so much that you just completely abandon what you've been ordered to do mid-battle. And also personal animosity. Some of them were just like, I don't like this admiral, so he can go and kill himself on the French guns. I don't care, I'm staying right here. That is a serious, serious problem. And, well, although poor old Admiral Byng was almost certainly shot unfairly, the situation that he was put in the first place was almost entirely down to all of this kind of attitude, both ashore and in the fleet. It did in fact take the shooting of Admiral Byng and a few other major reforms to bring the fleet back up to spec. And eventually you do get the fleet back up to spec, because then you get battles like Quiberon Bay, which is perhaps a lot more in keeping with what you'd expect of the Royal Navy. But I would say that, yeah, that period is probably a lot more serious in terms of potentially crippling the Navy as a fighting force compared to the late 19th century. Hugh Fisher asks, can the tanks or self-propelled artillery on board a landing craft shoot while the vessel is in motion, or could a railway gun shoot if it was on board a train ferry? Generally speaking, no. And that's for two reasons. On the larger ships, i.e. the landing ship tanks, LSTs, the tanks are being held internally, so there is nowhere there for them to shoot that doesn't involve blowing a hole in the side of the ship that's carrying them. When it comes to smaller craft, LCTs, landing craft tank like this one, generally, again, speaking, no, because as you can see with this tank being deployed, the sides of the craft usually come up above the level of the gun turret. Now, some tanks with particularly high elevations on their guns might be able to, in theory, fire their guns over the top, but how would they aim at anything? Because they physically can't see, and they don't have, periscope fire control systems the way that ships do. Self-propelled artillery on board, yes, that probably could fire, because at that point, they are able to aim much, much higher. The landing craft, at least an open-top vessel like a landing craft tank and LCT, would probably be able to withstand the shock. But then why would you want to is more of the question, because, of course, you are on a moving platform, which means that wherever you're aiming for, that's probably the one place you're not going to hit. A railway gun on something the size of a train ferry, again, if it's an open-topped or partially open-topped, that would probably be doing a little bit better, especially in coastal waters, in terms of stability. The bigger problem at that stage would be, unlike a 3, 4, 5 inch howitzer or something like that you might find on a self-propelled piece of artillery on an LCT. If you're talking about a railway gun, that might be a 12, 14, 15, 16 inch thing. Firing that, the amount of force that would put into the decking and tracks of a railway ferry, I would begin to have concerns about the structural integrity, especially under repeated firings. So yeah, if you're going to fire anything on board a landing craft, it's probably going to be something like a small self-propelled artillery piece. But why? Because what are you going to hit, apart from possibly maybe just about land generically? Paul from Chicago asks, over the next 12 to 18 months, what had more of an impact, the loss of Neosho or the loss of Lexington? Now, that's actually a really good question, because the time period there is absolutely key. Traditionally, and I think correctly, it's often said that the loss of Neosho at Coral Sea was perhaps one of the more impactful losses, all things considered. And I think, broadly speaking, for 1942, that is true, because the US does not have many fast fleet oilers at all. And as harsh as it sounds, at the time of Coral Sea, Lexington being destroyed was annoying, but it wasn't critical to the overall war effort, because you still had Saratoga, Enterprise, Yorktown, Hornet coming online, Wasp, maybe kind of theoretically, obviously wanted to keep Ranger in the Atlantic, but you had options. You could still put together a decent carrier force. Now, fast forward to the time period that your question's asking about, 12 to 18 months later, i.e. pretty much effectively looking at the end of 42 into 43. I know technically 12 to 18 months covers early to mid 43 more accurately, but nonetheless, bear with me. By early 1943, the US has managed to build a few more fast fleet oilers, so Neosho's loss has been mitigated to a fair degree. But the US carrier force is in much worse condition because, well, Saratoga's still around, Enterprise is under repair, but Yorktown's been lost, Hornet's been lost, Wasp has been lost, obviously Lexington was already lost, and the Ranger is still staying in the Atlantic. And that means you get the situation where you have to bring in HMS Victorious, aka USS Robin, because in the start of 1943, bear in mind Saratoga needs a bit of work as well, just not as badly as Enterprise, but by the start of the period that you're referring to, the US is looking at basically one operational fleet carrier under their own flag in the Pacific. And despite the mauling that the Japanese air groups have got, they still have Shikaku, Zuikaku, and the dubious services of Hyo and Junyo, and various other smaller carriers. So 12 to 18 months down the line, if you were given the choice of which one would you want back, I can bet you early 43 they would have absolutely wanted Lexington back far, far, far more than they would have wanted Neosho back. And while the presence of Lexington wouldn't really have made much difference to the outcome of the Battle of Midway, you can probably make a pretty strong argument that having Lexington around would have made a fairly substantial difference to the outcomes of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz Islands. So yeah, she would have been a lot more useful towards the tail end of 42 and into 43 than Neosho, even though the loss of Neosho in the first half and middle of 42 was initially the more impactful. HMS Inconceivable asks, since he has been mentioned a few times, could you give us some interesting tidbits about the service of author and naval officer Lieutenant Commander Douglas Reeman, Royal Navy? Well, Douglas Reeman was a prolific author. He did books that covered the World War II period, as well as, under the pseudonym of Alexander Kent, of course, the Bolitho series, which has been asked about recently. But in terms of his career highlights, etc., well, obviously I didn't ever know him personally, but I can give you some rather interesting anecdotes from his obituary, because sadly he passed away in 2017, which kind of give you a flavour of the character of the man, and it makes me think I probably would have liked him in real life. So, at the outbreak of World War II, age 16, he signs up to the Royal Navy. He's put on a training ship and discovers he can't really swim, which is a bit of a problem because by this point the Royal Navy does require its sailors to know how to swim. So instead of giving up on his dream of serving in the Navy, he just gets his best mate and says, "Oi, you're going to pretend to be me when we do the swimming tests." And apparently the instructors were just a little bit short-sighted, so yeah, his friend did his swimming test for him, and he continued into the Navy. At some point he must have discovered at least how to stay afloat, because after being assigned for half a year on convoy duty, his ship sank and the depth charges on board went off as it went down, which caused him some injuries. After recovering, he transferred to MTBs, the motor torpedo boats, which he seemed to enjoy quite a lot. And then by the time of D-Day, in June 44, at some point he transferred from MTBs to landing craft, which wasn't uncommon given how many landing craft needed crews, and well, MTB crews were pretty used to manoeuvring small craft under fire. And his landing craft was also shelled, so he got injured again. So after having been injured at least twice, he managed to avoid injury for the rest of the war, and the end of the war found him fetched up at Kiel after that port had endured the wonderful attentions of the Royal Air Force, and he remained in the Royal Navy Reserves thereafter. So although he had a civilian career, he did go back into the Navy for the Korean War, although he doesn't seem to have seen any action there. And then he decided, well, I'm going to spend the rest of my life living on a yacht and doing my day job and starting his writing career in the late 1950s, a writing career that pretty much lasted the rest of his life. One little touch I especially like is that in later life he decided he was going to have to move ashore from his yacht, and on the terrace of his house in Surrey he kept a Napoleonic-era cannon which he made sure he aimed at France, because of course he did. Matt Kidd asks, did small ships like the Black Joke ever run into problems dealing with larger numbers of crew and freed slaves on some of the captured slaving vessels, as some of those vessels carried 500 or more slaves and dozens of crew, whereas Black Joke carried on average 40 sailors and marines? As far as I can tell, not really. Apart from the fact that a number of slaver vessels tried to put up resistance by firing on the Black Joke, then ultimately ended up losing, because it turns out a bunch of slavers are no match for a well-trained Royal Navy crew when it comes to ship-to-ship gunnery. But once the ship had actually surrendered, well, the protocols of surrender were pretty well understood, so if the Royal Navy ship, in this case Black Joke, put aboard a small boarding party and said, or prize crew, and said, right, we're going here, then usually the crew would do that. Sometimes Black Joke would accompany the captured ship as well, as double insurance, but more generally, especially considering that ultimately these slaver ships are merchant ships, they understand what's at stake here. The Royal Navy is the single largest and most powerful navy on the planet, and whilst they might get into some trouble for slaving, if they were to, let's say, kill the half dozen or so Royal Navy men aboard their ship, retake it and sail off, well, the Black Joke is going to know which ship that is, and then word is going to be passed around the entirety of all the world's oceans that this particular ship not only has dishonoured the rules of surrender, which even most warships didn't do, but has also killed out of hand Royal Navy prize crew, at which point there would be absolutely no mercy and very, very few places to run for that ship and that crew in the near future. And so, based on that understanding, people tended to just do what the Royal Navy said, because the big implication of "or else" it was definitely hanging over their heads like the sword of Damocles. And as far as the slaves were concerned, well, the Royal Navy crew was taking them somewhere that wasn't slavery, so, that's all good as far as they're concerned. Reaver's Rambling Recess asks, given the disaster that happened to USS Wasp, what would you have done with the final tonnage to get a vessel that was useful to the US Navy in the upcoming conflict? What would it have been for, and could it have been designed in such a way as to be a useful ongoing production design, even while the bigger yards were frantically working out how to produce Essexes en masse? Well, as I kind of mentioned in the video about naval engineering failures, I would have taken a potential Wasp design in one of two directions. Either I would have replicated what the US Navy had done with the Lexingtons and quietly bolted on the 3,000 additional tons I've got for refits, plus a little bit of creative accounting to essentially allow myself to have built another Yorktown with the serial numbers filed off. As I say, maybe some slight aesthetic changes so that I can claim honestly, Gov, it is a little bit lighter than it looks. Or if I've absolutely got to stick with the tonnage that Wasp was actually built for, then again, as I mentioned, I personally would have gone with one of the other design options. So the US Navy looked at essentially, on this tonnage, what can we do if we have the speed, protection, and air group of a Yorktown? And they worked out that they could have two. So they could have a ship with the air group and the protection, but it would be very slow. A ship with the air group and the speed, but no protection, which is essentially what they ended up with, or a ship with the speed and the protection, but a reduced air group. And I personally would have gone with that latter choice. So keep the speed, because you need a fleet carrier, so the speed is near enough non-negotiable. You need at least 29-30 knots. Keep the protection, so that the ship stays afloat in most circumstances, and reduce the air group. And then you're talking about a reduction to about 50 to 60 aircraft. Now, at that point, you do have a couple of choices. You could go USS Ranger style and say, look, I'm just not going to carry torpedoes, so my 60 aircraft are going to be 30-ish fighters and 30 Dauntlesses, at which point, well, the torpedo strike role is then limited to the Yorktowns and the Lexingtons. Or you could have just tried to do the whole thing in miniature and have 20, 20, and 20, or 24, 24, and 12, or something like that. Personally, I would have probably, admittedly using a little bit of hindsight, but probably would have equipped it with maybe 24 fighters and loads of dive bombers. So it gives me a really big punch and just enough to provide combat air patrol and maybe a little bit of escort. And then perhaps as time went on, in the latter stages of the war, if it's not got torpedo magazines, then perhaps I could become, or this ship could become, the fighter carrier for the fleet, providing the combat air patrol in its entirety. So the more balanced ships could provide, the strike packages that go out. But if I then ditch most, if not all, of the strike capability, then I've got a vessel that can probably hold maybe 70 fighters, especially once a folding wing aircraft come into play. And if I'm holding just 70 fighters and I get a nice CIC up there in the island, then potentially I could run pretty much the entire air defense for a carrier group, which leaves the other carriers free to focus pretty much entirely on just getting aircraft out there to hit the enemy. Would it have been a useful ongoing production design? Well, the Essex class had already started production well before war broke out, so I don't think you'd have seen many of these built, because it would be just filling the tonnage while the US is obeying the treaties. So I don't think you'd see more than one, but at that point it could have been somewhat more useful. Of course, you do have the whole issue of, exactly the strike that hit Wasp probably would have finished off almost any carrier, but, very, very small butterfly changes, and that kind of stuff. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, do you think there is anything that could have realistically been done to keep Titanic afloat long enough for Carpathia to arrive, or at least long enough to save more lives? Given the nature of Titanic's bow-first flooding, would it have added minutes to Titanic's existence to have promptly flooded the aftmost compartment shortly after it struck the iceberg? Well, assuming that we're talking about a scenario where Titanic has been constructed as she was constructed, she's struck the iceberg, she's run past it, so we can't change either her fundamental design or the way that she actually impacts the iceberg, I think there are only really two things that you could realistically have done to either increase the survivability of the passengers or to keep Titanic afloat a little bit longer. But both of them are going to be relatively marginal, and one of them would be very much a shot in the dark unless you were really careful and or lucky. So one thing would be to get the crew to batten down as many hatches as possible and perhaps construct emergency bulkheads out of, furniture, doors, anything really. Because, of course, the actual bulkheads only extend up so far. So, obviously, you would hope that the walls are relatively watertight, at least for a short period of time. But if the general, doors, etc., through the ship are not, well, you could build emergency bulkheads relatively quickly, given the number of crew that Titanic had, maybe enlist some of the passengers as well. That's not going to stop the overtopping floodwaters for too long, but it would delay slightly. And obviously every minute that you delay the ship flooding is a minute more that people are on the ship rather than in the water, and that's a minute more that they're not spending in the icy water, which gives you more time, hopefully more time for Carpathia to arrive. And related to that, given that they knew that they didn't have enough lifeboats, perhaps also stripping down furniture and so forth to put together at least basic rafts. Now, of course, that would require a huge amount of organised effort on the part of the crew and a lot of the passengers, but in theory it could be done, and between the shared measures, you might buy Titanic maybe 10-15 more minutes afloat, and you might also buy a number of passengers another half hour or so if they're only partially submerged rather than fully submerged in the water, which might allow more of them to survive. The other thing that you could potentially do, but this is where it's much more reliant on luck, would be that, as well as immediately sending out distress calls, try and get in contact with a nearby ship, such as Carpathia, and if you can, get in contact by radio and establish roughly where each ship is, because of course they don't know exactly where they are, this being an era before GPS, but if you can establish, for example, that Carpathia is somewhere north of Titanic, then possibly the other thing would have been to put the ship into reverse. You don't want to keep going forward, because that's going to increase the water pressure on the breaches in the forward part of the ship. But at least in the very, very early portion of Titanic sinking, if you knew that there were rescue ships somewhere to the north, you potentially could have put Titanic in reverse and reversed it north at however fast Titanic could reverse. Now, of course, this is still going to somewhat increase the water flow into those breaches rather than the ship just being static. But you might be able to buy yourself enough distance north, because of course every mile that you manage to head north is also a mile less that Carpathia has to do to head south towards you. And that might, again, buy you some time, especially if you combine it. So, you know, your engineering crew and some guys on the bridge have the ship in reverse going backwards, and you put the rest of the crew into efforts to build emergency bulkheads and lock down as many hatches and nail them shut if necessary, and make them as watertight as possible. Collectively, maybe that might buy you half an hour to an hour. I don't know. I'd have to look into it into far more detail, but that might buy you enough time. And of course, it also is, you know, it's doubly helping, because not only are you getting further north, but as I said, because Carpathia has to come further south, her run to you will end sooner. There's also the incidental issue of, if you do head north, you might just about get Californian to pay attention to you, and they're obviously a lot closer. Now, of course, at some point the flooding will get to a stage where you're going to have to stop and start lowering boats, but, you know, who knows, you might just about have bought enough time to save a few hundred more lives. Admiralty of Floof asks, inspired by Brew Ships 154, suppose the Japanese somehow capture Hawaii and find an upright, intact battleship, or maybe they find one in Singapore, or Bismarck surrenders, or something like that. Can trained sailors, perhaps aided by translators, but not the previous owners of the ship, figure out how to at least basically operate it? And if not, when did this possibility to just go aboard a ship and get it moving with a trained crew come to an end? I think it depends partially on the condition of the ship and partially on what you mean by basic operation. So if, for example, the ship is in steam and so the boiler pressure's up, and all you have to do is get the ship moving at a given speed in order to get her back to one of your own ports. So in the examples you list, perhaps something like Bismarck surrendering, presumably before she's battered all to hell and back, but there you go. In that case, with translators and experienced enough crew, in World War II, you probably could just about pull that off, because you essentially, as you've probably seen if you've been on museum ships, there are written guidance notes in the engineering spaces, etc. of, you know, don't let the steam exceed this pressure, you know, basic how to run the ship ideas. And between translators and an experienced crew who already know their way around a steam power plant, you could probably keep the steam pressure at least within the margins that you needed to keep the ship underway. And, well, steering is pretty easy, assuming the steering gear isn't completely shot. However, once the ship drops back down to inert, i.e. something like a hypothetical capture of Hawaii or the Japanese capture of Singapore, it becomes a lot more difficult, because exactly how you light off this particular type of boiler, which valves you need to open to ensure fuel supply, how you get it up to speed, how you even light the blasted thing, all of that varies quite considerably. So you'd need the manuals as well, and you need extensive study. So at that point, it becomes not so much go aboard the ship with a trained crew and get it going. It becomes, okay, well, we have this ship. Hopefully the instruction manuals have survived. Now we have to sit down and spend a lot of time working out how to make it work. It's not impossible. The Japanese, after all, salvaged a few small Allied warships and got them going in auxiliary roles. But it is considerably more difficult. And again, this is just to get the ship going. When you're talking about a major war vessel like a cruiser or a battleship, then you've got the additional complications of How do you get the fire control systems to work? What kind of voltage are you running at? What kind of pressure is your power plant running at if you want to get up to speed? All of this kind of thing. In theory, you could work out how all this works, but it would take a long time. This would be a case of, well, we've got the ship there, and we're now going to spend, a year and a half translating out all the manuals, retraining people who already have a vague idea of how a similar system should work, and getting it all operational. That's a far cry from, hey, we found this thing, we can make it work for our side. I think the ability to do that probably came to an end some point around the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, because around that time you start to see a movement away from a steam plant is a steam plant is a steam plant. There may be specific variations in manufacturer, but it's pretty understandable by all parties how this kind of stuff works. And similarly with guns, very early fire control systems, pretty much everyone understands how they work. There are small variations, but it's not out of the realms of an experienced crew to work out what those changes are, especially if they have some translators. But then by the time you transition into the Dreadnought period and then World War I, the divergence of equipment specifications, pressures, uses, drives, etc. starts to become considerably greater, and it starts to become more of a case of, well, we could potentially sit back, assuming we have all the manuals, and work out how to make this thing work, but it's not going to be a case like you would have in the Age of Sail of just putting some people aboard and immediately running the ship. George Robert asks, I once again ran across the 1939 incident at Tsingtao when the HMS Birmingham rescued a British merchant ship from under the guns of 3 Japanese heavy cruisers. I thought her captain showed Royal Navy pluck at its finest there. Who was he, and did he do anything else interesting? The captain of Birmingham at the time was Eric James Patrick Brind, and he'd actually served in the First World War on a variety of ships, monitors, gunboats, and HMS Malaya, and prior to his command of HMS Birmingham, he'd commanded the Leander-class light cruiser HMS Orion. However, once you have this incident at Tsingtao, a short while after that, not because of the incident, but just because of rotations, Birmingham was recalled back to the UK. She arrived at Portsmouth in 1940, and there was a change in command. Brind then went on to be the Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet, which was Admiral Tovey for a good period of time, from 1940 when he left Birmingham through to mid-1942. He then became the Assistant Chief to the Naval Staff. And he served in that role for another couple of years, until late 1944, when he was appointed to command the cruisers of the British Pacific Fleet, which he did in 1945 in the closing stages of the Second World War. Then in the immediate post-war period, he was the commander of president of the Royal Navy College in Greenwich, and then from 1949 to 1951, he was the commander-in-chief of the Far East Station, previously known as the China Station, and then he returned to Europe to become Commander-in-Chief Allied Forces Northern Europe for another couple of years until he then retired in 1953. So most of the Second World War, apart from that last bit at the end in the Pacific, he spent his time doing staff work ashore, although interestingly enough, he was the Commander-in-Chief, as mentioned in at the end of the 1940s, beginning of the 1950s, over in the Far East when the Amethyst incident took place. So he was the coordinator on the scene for that whole issue, which is a rather interesting one. So unfortunately, he didn't do any more significant fighting duties, but he did do a lot of very, very vital staff work, eventually retiring with the rank of Admiral. Richard Shu asks, how often did mechanical malfunctions happen on British, US and Japanese carrier aircraft? Did this change during the war? And what was the respective procedures and policies of these navies regarding recovering aircraft with mechanical problems when every carrier is launching aircraft? Well, again, Chris from Military Aviation History or Rex from Rex's Hangar would be much better placed to provide comparative details between individual carrier aircraft to see, which one is more or less reliable. But in broader terms, some aircraft were seen as considerably more reliable than others. The Swordfish, for example, had a good reputation for reliability. Its theoretical replacement, the Albacore, actually, in fact, had more maintenance issues than the Swordfish did. And likewise, from what I've read, the Helldiver, the SB2C, at least initially, was far more of a hangar queen than the Dauntless was, which was one of the many reasons it wasn't seen as a particularly popular aircraft. Now, as the war progressed, the rate of mechanical malfunction generally trended down, certainly in the US and British navies. In the Japanese Navy, it's a little bit more difficult because, of course, in theory, their aircraft are getting more reliable as the issues are worked out with them, but equally, there are fewer of them, they're being run more ragged, so that's going to increase the number of mechanical issues. And as mentioned, specific aircraft would be more or less prone to mechanical malfunctions than others. It also depends how you define a mechanical malfunction. Is a mechanical malfunction the landing gear fails to retract, or is it the engine starts stuttering, or is it breaks a lot? Because if it's the latter, well, the Seafire was notorious for that kind of mechanical malfunction, breaking its spine every so often, in fact, quite often when it tried to land. But that's an issue once the aircraft lands, not whilst it's in the sky, at least unless you've poorly repaired it the last time it broke itself, at which point it might come apart mid-air if you're really, really unlucky. But what were the policies regarding recovering aircraft with mechanical problems if every carrier was launching aircraft? It would depend on the severity of the problem. If it's the engine's cut out, well, the aircraft would have to ditch at that point. If it's something like, well, the engine's running really rough, or as I said, maybe one of the landing gear hasn't retracted or something similar, then the aircraft would just have to fly a holding pattern until enough of the air group aboard the carrier has been launched that there was clear space aft for the aircraft in question to land. Because bear in mind, on World War II carriers, a lot of aircraft had performance such that you could, in theory at least, still have aircraft taking off up front while you landed an aircraft aft. It wasn't necessarily the safest thing in the world. You would prefer to do one or the other, not both, but you could do it if one of the aircraft needed to recover relatively soonish. Cisco Fan asks, in the Sojourn audio drama, which is a science fiction story based on the Age of Sail, in the background lore, ships are often seen striking their colours and surrendering, with the crews of the surrendered ships often being ransomed back to their nation, and the ships themselves being pressed into service by the enemy that captured them. In the real world, when did navies culturally transition from losing a ship being annoying but not unheard of, to where by World War I it was considered abhorrent to surrender a ship to almost anyone? Who led this transition, and why did everyone else follow along? It's difficult to pin down exactly, but I would say you're probably looking around the 1860s to the 1870s, the period of the ironclad. Now, that's not to say there aren't surrenders afterwards. There's obviously some quite famous mass surrenders in the Russo-Japanese War. But broadly speaking, I think that shift comes in that 1860 to 1870 period. And that's for a few reasons. Firstly, just culturally, before that, when you're talking, well before that, Napoleonic Wars and before, risks to capital ships came from all sorts of different directions. The British lost far more ships to the weather than they did to enemy action in the Napoleonic Wars. So when you could have a ship taken out for all sorts of reasons, most of which would be beyond your control, losing a ship to enemy action has slightly less sting. Additionally, building ships, even large capital ships, could be done a lot more quickly, and repurposing captured enemy ships could be done a lot more quickly or at all. Plus, in actual combat, especially when you're looking at a first or second or third rate ship of the line, it was widely understood that a exchange of gunfire might result in your ship being fundamentally incapable of manifestly fighting back, but still be very capable of remaining afloat, at which point reducing that floating but unable to fight wreck of a ship to a sinking condition would take an awful long time and would result in the slaughter of potentially hundreds of men for no real benefit to anybody, and therefore the humane thing to do would be to surrender, because that preserves the lives of your men. And as I said, ultimately at that point, both because of losses, where losses could come from and how quickly you could build ships, the loss of any individual ship would be embarrassing, but it's not the end of the world compared to those crews being preserved and potentially being able to then be put on another ship to fight later on. But once you get into the era of iron and steam, suddenly ships being lost to the weather and to the environment, whilst it does happen, is a lot less common than it used to be, which means that the number of warships that are lost goes down dramatically, so therefore losses in combat will proportionally make up a greater portion of your losses, assuming you ever fight anyone, which makes them appear more important. Plus, because ships are now much larger and much more expensive, there's fewer of them. Look at the number of first, second, and third rates the Royal Navy has in the Napoleonic Wars, or even immediately thereafter, compared to the number of ironclad battleships the Royal Navy has even after 2 decades of construction. So individually, ships become far more valuable. And because of armour and then the advent of explosive shells, not only is the ship more valuable and you don't want it to be in enemy hands, but also the chance of the ship being battered into a sinking condition or an exploding condition before it is completely unable to fight back is much, much higher. So, a ship could go down with all hands while still firing its guns in the era of armoured vessels, whereas in the era of the Age of Sail, that would be extremely unusual. And the sort of principle of when you could surrender in the Age of Sail was when you could offer no real meaningful resistance. The chance that you probably could offer something approaching meaningful resistance a lot of the time, right up until almost the last minute, and at which point, the ship may not have sunk, but it's probably irrevocably on its way there, leads to this cultural shift of, well, if you give up your ship before then, you probably could have continued fighting, therefore it becomes much more dishonourable. Now, obviously, this does take some time to bed in, because there are instances where ironclad ships are battered into submission and are incapable of really fighting back and therefore surrender. I already mentioned there were surrenders after the Battle of Tsushima, although that was more to do with the ships being horrifically outnumbered and very clearly about to be blown out of the water to no particular benefit for either Russia or the Russian crews, more so than their exact physical condition at the time. But in a lot of ways, those kinds of things are exceptions that prove the rule, because, as I said, the general gist of it was that you don't surrender unless and until your ship is incapable of any further meaningful resistance. But ships became more and more capable of meaningful resistance for much, much longer. And this gradually conflated into this culture of, well, we just do not surrender, period. Sam Savicki asks, in regards to the Trent affair, could you briefly try and explain what laws existed internationally around the affair when it happened, what each nation's stance was on why they did what they did at the time, and then claim the other party broke maritime law? It appears like the British were likely in the right on the issue, but it's also said that this was a reversal of their own previous statements and stance on maritime law around the handling of ships that may be moving papers, people, or cargo of a third-party belligerent nation. So the very basics of it is that there were 2 Confederate envoys aboard a British ship, the RMS Trent, which was then stopped by the USS San Jacinto, which then removed the Confederate envoys, as they were obviously part of a party that was hostile to the United States. The issue blew up because obviously the British vessel was neutral, but also because of the exact nature of the Trent. Now, the reason why Sam mentions a reversal of British policy is that historically, both before and after this particular affair, the British had traditionally maintained what they called belligerent rights, which was the rights to stop and search neutral shipping for contraband of war, whether that be guns, ammunition, and other supplies, or in this case, people, and then remove them if necessary, or take the ship as a prize, if necessary, depending on the nature. Obviously, with people, you can take them off the ship. If it's carrying a massive load of ammunition, then you have to take the ship into port as a prize, etc. And this had been something of an ongoing issue of tension between the US and Britain all the way back to the early 1800s, and would continue to be a bit of a bone of contention in the early part of the First World War. So on the face of it, the US Navy turning around and doing a similar thing to a neutral British vessel could be seen as the Royal Navy saying, yeah, rules for thee, but not for me. The flip side, of course, was that one of the supposed major grievances that the US went to war with in 1812 was the fact that British ships were randomly stopping American ships and taking people off that they felt like taking off, which was exactly what the US had just done to the Trent. So both sides had kind of swapped around a little bit. And then there was this whole question of, do humans qualify as contraband of war at all? The general body of law at the time suggested perhaps not. And then there was also the fact that if you did take a neutral ship, you were supposed to take it to a prize court where it could be independently adjudicated as to whether or not what you had done was correct, whereas the San Jacinto had just taken off what it wanted and left Trent to go about its business. There were also some other complicating factors. Firstly, Trent was not just a regular ship. Remember I said she was RMS Trent, Royal Mail Ship Trent. That introduced an additional layer of complexity, because if she was a fully private vessel, then it still would have been a problem, but somewhat less of one. A Royal Mail ship, however, was officially chartered in part by the government to carry official correspondence, and therefore there was both a risk of just disruption to that correspondence arriving in decent time, which would be interfering in the affairs of state of another power if the ship had been taken offline, if you will, to a prize court, or potentially sensitive government documents in that mail may have been read by agents of a third party, i.e. the crew of the San Jacinto, both of which are much more serious issues than if Trent had just been the SS Trent. And then there's the whole thorny issue, which, as far as I understand it, is still something of a, not necessarily a matter of debate, but a matter of a great rancor in the United States to this day, which is, what exactly was the Confederacy? Because if the Confederacy was completely illegitimate and just a group of rebels, that would be one thing. If the Confederacy was a legitimate alternate country, a different country, so you had the Confederate States of America and the Union, then that would be a completely different matter entirely. And obviously with the latter would come diplomatic recognition as a separate entity. At the time, most of Europe, including Britain, had taken a kind of middle ground where they had declared neutrality. But the thing is, you can only declare neutrality when there are two belligerents fighting each other. That indicates a degree of separation between the two that you recognise, without necessarily recognising that both belligerent parties are fully recognised states. But the Union wasn't very happy with that, because if you by declaring neutrality, the European governments had tacitly not necessarily endorsed the Confederacy, but they seem to have seen the Confederacy as an inevitable break-off state from the greater United States. And so they were kind of hedging their bets a little bit by implying that, yes, there are two separate powers here at war rather than an internal rebellion, which is the way the Union would have preferred to have everybody perceive it. That's further complicated by the fact that President Lincoln at one point declared that there would be a blockade of Confederate ports, but according to international law, you could only blockade the ports of a separate belligerent power. You don't blockade your own ports. And so if the Confederacy was indeed just a group of rebels and everything was actually still the contiguous United States, then declaring a blockade against ports in the United States wasn't valid. But by declaring a blockade, you were saying, well, actually, the Confederate States are a separate entity and we are at war with them and blockading them, which is actually a step further than what the Declaration of Neutrality in Europe was doing. Lincoln eventually apparently walked that one back. But at the time, obviously, exactly what status the Confederacy had amongst everybody was a little bit up in the air. And so in this environment, everything got very heated very quickly, to the point that the British started shipping out troops and equipment to defend Canada against a possible American invasion. Great Eastern was actually used as a troop ship in this regard. And the Royal Navy started drawing up plans not to cooperate with the Confederacy, but to blow apart the Union blockade of Confederate ports and blockade Union ports, more as a general matter of principle than anything else. And the British were also moving to cut off the supply of weapons and ammunition and powder to the Union, which in the first part of the American Civil War was a huge boost for the Union, so potentially getting that cut out from under them would have been a bit of a problem. And the whole thing was thrown into further confusion when the US realised that, well, again, it comes down to this matter of who is the Confederacy, because if the Confederacy was an internal rebellion, and therefore everything was just United States of America, then there was no war, there was no hostilities, therefore the San Jacinto had no belligerent rights, therefore its boarding of Trent and seizure of anybody, whether they be American, Confederate, or British, would have been completely against international law. But in all that, broadly speaking, the seizure failed, according to international law at the time, on three grounds. Firstly, no one could find any precedent that people constituted contraband of war. It was slightly different for soldiers who might be heading for an active combat zone, but these men were supposed to be diplomats heading to a neutral third party. So they didn't count as contraband, therefore the seizure was illegal at that point. Secondly, as mentioned, the Union was still trying to treat the Confederacy as internal rebels. If they were, then San Jacinto had no right to stop the Trent, because at that point it would have just been a wanted citizen of the United States who's now on a neutral third-party ship. That doesn't give you belligerent rights for a warship to haul up and just randomly shoot at and then board the neutral third party. And if the Confederacy was a separate entity with belligerent status, which therefore would justify the boarding, if not necessarily the seizure of individuals, you still had the problem of the fact that the boarding had been done and people removed without any further recourse to arbitration via a prize court, which would have also made the whole thing illegal as well. And in the end, as it turned out, the two representatives that were seized were actually released by the Union and allowed to continue on their journey to Europe. Connor Johnson asks, could you tell us a bit more about the Japanese 27-inch torpedo mentioned in the Long Lance video? I wish I could. Basically, it was a very small reference in a couple of the books that I used in coming up with the script for that video. They mentioned a 27.5-inch weapon designed and built in Fiume, i.e. by the Whitehead Company, around 1900 for the Imperial Japanese Navy, and it's mentioned in a context that suggests it was a coastal defense weapon, which makes sense because lumbering a 27.5-inch torpedo on a circa 1900 torpedo boat or destroyer is probably not going to end very well. But that's really about all that was immediately available, and it's something that's been bugging me ever since. The problem is, unlike naval guns, there's not really that many books that have been written about the history of torpedoes, and those that are, they tend to focus firstly on British and American efforts, and secondly, they tend to focus more on obviously World War I and World War II when the torpedo really comes to the fore. There's not really a huge amount of literature circa, or covering the period circa, the very early 1900s, which is when this apparently rather abortive torpedo was constructed. So for more details, I need to do a bit more research. Robert Knapp asks, how much, if any, difference would it have made to the war in the Mediterranean if the British had taken control of the French squadron interned at Alexandria rather than allow it to be disarmed? How capable was the force? Would it have tipped the balance at all in the first couple of years of war in the Mediterranean? It depends how they take control of it. If it's a case of they gain control of it and the French crews are willing to serve alongside the Royal Navy, at least in large part, that's one thing. If they have to physically take control of them and then somehow recrew them, that's another. Because if they have to recrew them, that's going to get difficult. But if we assume, for the sake of argument, as in actually being able to make much use at all of them, that when Admiral Cunningham writes his appeal out to the French sailors, they kind of go, yeah, actually, no, the majority of us want to join up, rather than go off and sit in Alexandria for the next 3 years. Well, let's go through the forces that are there. There's one submarine, the Protée. It's a useful addition, but one submarine is not really going to change much. There's 3 destroyers, Basque, Forbin, and Fortune. those would be useful. Again, they're not deal breakers one way or the other, but 3 destroyers, especially 3 fast French destroyers, even if they're somewhat on the smaller side of the French fleet, are still very, very useful in, given that the scrap iron flotilla was seen as incredibly useful, and they're even smaller, much, much older destroyers. 3 relatively quick French destroyers of a decent size would be very welcome. The battleship Lorraine, as you can see here, this would be somewhat useful, but not hugely. It's an older ship. It's not had as much in terms of refit, so it's pretty much on a par, at least age-wise, with Malaya and the R types that were put under Cunningham's command. It is, of course, a somewhat older design with smaller guns, so it's not quite as useful as them. So Lorraine would be useful initially as part of the slow line, but more broadly speaking, as the war in the Mediterranean gets going, it would very much be a second-line duty vessel. Where things really get interesting are the cruisers. There's one light cruiser, WWII. She's actually a pretty darn decent design, as I've mentioned before, albeit she's a light cruiser. The other element, though, is heavy cruisers. There are 3. There is the 2 Duquesnes, Duquesne and Tourville, as well as the Suffren, which is one of the immediate successors to the Duquesne class. Now, I have before repeatedly pointed out I consider the Duquesnes to be some of the worst heavy cruisers of the interwar period, and I stand by that. However, they are still heavy cruisers. 3 8-inch heavy cruisers is something that Cunningham never had in the Mediterranean fleet against the Italians. He'd occasionally get a single heavy cruiser in, but it very soon had to leave for various reasons. If he's got a force of 3 French heavy cruisers, bear in mind they're going to be relatively quick. Yes, they basically have negligible protection at all, but as long as they're not hit all that much, it's not going to matter too much. And, I have said, the Duquesne's lack of armor would work against them, and it would. If they were hit, this would be a major, major problem. But when you look at the number of times British cruisers operating under Cunningham's flag were hit in gunfire exchanges, in these particular circumstances, maybe not so much of a risk. But one of the big things that the British did find fighting the Italians, especially in the early part of that campaign, was that the Italian heavy cruisers could show up, and with their 8-inch guns, they could comfortably outrange and threaten the British light cruisers. If the British light cruiser force, obviously with WWII as well, are able to be supplemented by this trio of French heavy cruisers, those French heavy cruisers can potentially go toe-to-toe with the Italian heavy cruisers, which allows the Anglo-French force to operate on a much more consistent, aggressive footing, rather than having to turn tail and run for the battleships every time the Trentos or the Zaras pop up over the horizon. Now, would this have tipped the balance? Maybe not, but it certainly could have flipped around how quite a number of different battles went. Rob Smith asks, I know you've had a number of questions about pirates, but I don't recall any about the other maritime pastime, namely smuggling. So, smuggling has been a long-held tradition and pastime amongst many, and many coastal communities have done so for, I would guess, as long as there have been duties to be raised and prices were unfairly passed one way or another. Excluding military material, did this trade persist during the 2 world wars? Well, if you exclude the smuggling trade in various military material from ostensibly neutral countries like Switzerland, yes, smuggling did take place in and around the UK and various other countries during the World Wars, but not quite in the same way it would have done in peacetime. So obviously in peacetime you'd have smuggling where a ship or a small craft would have some kind of illicit cargo. They'd come ashore in a relatively quiet cove or harbour or a small town, and people would ferry the supplies off, and they'd be sold off, obviously, for money. The problem, to a certain extent, in World War I, and especially in World War II, was that the coastlines were monitored extremely heavily, and ships were supposed to be in convoys. So if you had single ships going out on their own trying to do smuggling, well, you were very likely to be picked off as an easy victim by the Germans, and if you weren't, then you'd almost certainly be thought to be some kind of German intelligence ship and then bombed, sunk, or otherwise had a rather violent intervention by the British. So that kind of smuggling, for the most part, was largely off the table. Where smuggling did occur was either aboard ships that were as part of convoys, and this was fairly low-level stuff it's not bulk goods, but it would be the kind of thing of, well, this ship is transporting something that is fairly heavily rationed. Let's say it's transporting several thousand tons of sugar. Well, if you're transporting 5,050 tons of sugar, well, by the time you reach port, 5,049.5 tons of sugar might be aboard, and well, some of that obviously has been lost in spillages and breakages and water contamination, that kind of thing. But the bulk of the sugar has arrived, so obviously that would be go into the system, and quietly there'd be a couple of 100 kilos of sugar maybe hiding out in the crew quarters and the captain's cabin and so on and so forth, that might then be either transported to their families or sold on for a profit on the black market. And this would occur when ships were undamaged, but if ships were damaged, well, Governor, I'm really sorry to say we were desperately trying to transport your 5,000 tons of preserved beef, but, well, the bomb hit did destroy one of our cargo holds, so there's only 4,000 tons of preserved beef. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the ship, there may be a few fairly large sides of beef and steak that have been quietly put aside. And that's the more organised, at sea kind of smuggling. And then you also have, hilariously enough, a fairly active smuggling trade going on at the borders of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Because, of course, the Republic of Ireland was neutral and didn't really have rationing on much, if anything, and sometimes would even have quite a bit of surplus. And so you would very often have large numbers of people who would just so happen to be in Northern Ireland and would just so happen to want to take a day trip across the border and would just so happen to come back with slightly fuller bags. And, well, the customs officers did get wise to this after a fairly short period of time, but then at the same time, the customs officers themselves were also on rations. So, if they were taken away from their border post by the offer of a good drink and a good meal, well, if few people happen to cross over the line, maybe, a lady who definitely crossed into the Republic of Ireland looking fit as a fiddle and came back waddling heavily pregnant, well, keep the beer coming, and I didn't see that, Governor. That kind of stuff. Eric Van Dooting asks, I heard a comment that part of the reason the Yamato-class ships had poor anti-aircraft capabilities, aside from the quality issues of the guns themselves, was that they lacked the electrical generating capability to power a sufficient number of directors and mounts. Could you discuss if that is accurate in your opinion, and any other issues that might be related? I've certainly not heard that myself. I would be a bit hesitant in ascribing that as a specific weakness of the Yamato class for quite a variety of reasons. And, apart from anything else, look at the sheer number of guns that Yamato had once she was refitted in with, more and more anti-aircraft. That's not a number of guns that you would find on a ship that's lacking in power. And on top of that, the biggest restriction when you look at that layout is the blast effects of the 18.1-inch guns, which, as we know, were already a problem for quite a number of those particular weapons. The overall amount of power that you'd need for a handful of additional anti-aircraft gun directors is negligible compared to the total power requirements of a ship like Yamato, and with various other systems that wouldn't be in use, like, say, the cranes at the back of the aircraft in battle, there should have been more than enough power. And let's also bear in mind that remote power control, a feature that is found on a lot of US ships in their medium and heavy anti-aircraft batteries, towards the end of the war was something that the US led in. So finding a lack of remote power control on a Japanese battleship is not really that surprising because, well, they, as well as pretty much everybody else to a certain degree, were somewhat behind the curve in that regard. I think the confinement of where you could put anti-aircraft guns based on the blast effects of the 18.1-inch guns and just the general slightly behind the curve nature of Japanese anti-aircraft technology is far more of an issue for the Yamato class than any notional potential power shortage. Scott Jennings asks, thinking back to the life and career of able seaman Just Nuisance, I was wondering, have there been any other ship's mascots that have attracted a notable degree of fame or notoriety, or not so famous mascots you think are noteworthy for one reason or another? Well, of course, there's Simon, the ship's cat of HMS Amethyst. There's the whole thing about Unsinkable Sam and did he really exist? But there's such a multiplicity of ship's mascots. I mean, almost every ship had one back when they were allowed, that I think it would be almost impossible to go through any particular list without leaving out large numbers of other equally worthy animals. So I think I would probably just cap it all by saying that if you happen to do a little bit of a deep dive into ship's mascots, you will find some truly bizarre and weird and wonderful ones. I mean, outside of the 2nd Pacific Squadron and their floating menagerie, especially prior to World War II, ships seemed to adopt pretty much anything and everything they could get their hands on. Sometimes because somebody thought it would be funny to to sort of gift a ship something that matched its name. So HMS Eagle at various points was the recipient of a number of flying feathered friends. But when you look at the list of ships, you have ships disembarking lions, kangaroos, various raptors, as we already mentioned, a polar bear fetched up in Portsmouth at one point, having been rescued from a floating bit of ice off of Greenland. I'm not entirely sure how you make a polar bear a mascot aboard a ship without it eating half the crew, but there you go. Essentially, if it wasn't going to get so violently seasick it would throw itself off the ship at the first sign of trouble, then someone somewhere has adopted it as the mascot for their ship, including animals that would quite happily eat the crew if they could get free. Dylan Bartlett asks, during the period the channel covers, what were some of the strangest ammunition types used by navies around the world, and were any of them effective? Well, you've got the default, the Type 3 Senshiki anti-aircraft shells that the Japanese used. You've got Martin shell, the molten iron-filled shot or shell used in the 1860s aboard HMS Warrior, which is rather bizarre in that it was fantastically effective at setting fire to wooden warships, but was invented and deployed just in time for the main line ships of the major navies to become ironclad, which made the Martin shell considerably less effective. Then you've got the French in the interwar period invented shells that had poison gas canisters that could be inserted into them, despite the fact that almost everybody else concluding that gas shells were pretty ineffective in a naval engagement. And actually the absence of the poison gas canisters was one of the contributory factors as to why Richelieu kept having gun issues in her early conflicts with the Royal Navy. You then have common point capped shells. So in these 9.2-inch, that would be the one that's the third along. These are slightly bizarre on paper because essentially the British took a common shell, what we would call a high explosive shell, and stuck a small armour-piercing cap on it and just said, well, okay, now this thing can penetrate somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 its calibre in armour. So for a 9.2-inch shell, that would be maybe 4 inches of penetration. For a 12-inch shell, 5 to 6 inches. 13.5-inch shell, maybe 7 inches if you're lucky. And bizarrely enough, although this CPC shell I was only around for a relatively short period of time, as I may have mentioned in previous Drydocks, I actually think a number of British ships at Jutland would have actually been better off firing CPC because it has the armour penetration capability to go through the thinner plates of a distributed armour scheme, which is what the whole point of CPC was supposed to be for, and of course then delivers a considerably greater explosive payload than armor-piercing shell. But of course, with the number of issues that British armor-piercing shell had at the time, outside of a handful of hits like Invincible versus Lutzow, broadly speaking, I actually think the most of the British fleet at Jutland firing CPC probably would have done more damage to the German fleet than firing the faulty AP rounds. Randwick78 asks, it seems to me that the treaty cruisers ultimately were to the Royal Navy's disadvantage once the London Treaty was negotiated, where they had to accept a lesser number of 8-inch cruisers, including the Yorks, compared to the US Navy, in exchange for more light cruiser tonnage, which was still not enough to protect their empire's trade. Should they have accepted the scrapping of the Hawkins class and argued for smaller 6-inch armed cruisers at Washington, or was it something they could not have foreseen at the time? The British most definitely would have preferred everybody to stick to smaller 6-inch cruisers, and indeed in the various naval treaties they did argue, especially in the London naval treaties, for 6-inch cruisers to both be codified and reduced in tonnage. The problem with the Washington Treaty was that the Washington Treaty cruiser arrangements were mostly a kind of very quick cap based loosely around the gun caliber and displacement of cruisers that the three big nations were already building and then didn't really want to scrap, as opposed to any concerted effort to keep sizes down. I mean, the Royal Navy generally seems to have taken the approach at Washington of assuming that, yes, okay, there are these really big cruisers that everybody's building, but once everyone's gotten that out of their system, they're settled down clearly for the far more economical, smaller 6-inch armed cruisers, except, of course, what happened was everybody started building right up to the treaty limits, which forced everybody else to build up to the treaty limits, and so on and so forth. The problem with at Washington saying, okay, yeah, we'll scrap the Hawkins class and argue that everybody should have maybe a 6,000 or 7,000 ton limit with 6-inch as the maximum armament for cruisers, is persuading everybody else to go for that, because the Americans and the Japanese, as much as the Japanese kicked up a fuss about wanting to preserve Mutsu, having either completed or gotten partway through completing a bunch of fairly expensive fast cruisers armed with big guns, even if the Royal Navy had put on the table that they were willing to get rid of the Hawkins class, then I seriously do not think they would have been able to persuade the Japanese and the Americans to do the same. Because remember, a lot of what was being done at Washington was essentially saying, okay, look. This is as far as our current technology levels have generally, things like Hood aside, taken us. Let's leave a little margin for advancement and just cap things there. And that most people are willing to go along with, whereas taking a rather large step back and going, well, we retroactively want to step back to what cruisers were capable of 5 or 10 years earlier, that's going to be a much, much harder sell. And finally, Torono asks, to mark the 80th anniversary of D-Day, there was a small display aboard HMS Belfast to simulate the firing of her main guns, with one commenter joking the London Gateway services should be warned of incoming fire. However, this did spark a memory of my childhood reading, possibly in a Horrible Histories book, that during the VE or VJ Day celebrations, there was an incident where a Royal Navy ship did accidentally fire real shells instead of blanks, resulting in some of the last British civilian deaths of World War II. However, I've not been able to find any references to such an event. Are you aware of this event? And if true, how easy would it be to fire real shells instead of the intended blank? You know, when I was reading this question, I thought, I know exactly what you're talking about. I remember exactly the same incident, definitely from a Horrible Histories book. I even remember the little illustration of a cartoon battleship firing shells and everybody running for the hills. For the life of me, I cannot remember whether it was World War I or World War II. I've looked through my more recent copies of Horrible Histories and I can't find it, but I absolutely remember exactly what you're referring to. But I also can't find any reference to it elsewhere. So I'm going to throw this one out to everybody else. If anyone else either has a copy of which particular Horrible Histories book has it, then let us know and tell us what it says, and then I can do some more digging. Or if someone knows, the factual basis behind it, then also let us know. That'd be quite interesting. But in terms of how easy would it be to fire real shells instead of the intended blanks? In theory, you know, if you're told specifically we're firing blanks, it should be pretty difficult, because if you're firing a blank, you don't load a real shell. But it could come about through a number of different circumstances. It could be that you had real shells loaded and then you just fired them and forgot that you had shells in there. It could also be that the intention was to fire blank shells, but somewhere along the lines that got just translated into load and fire. And of course, if you're in the magazines or the turrets, you have no idea what's actually really going on outside or where your guns are aiming. So if you're just told load and fire, and somewhere along the lines the idea that you're just supposed to load blank charges has been lost, yeah, you could accidentally to go through a full loading cycle and end up blasting a small part of a town off the cliff. But that's it for today. Thank you very much for listening to the second part of Drydock episode 304. And, well, at this point, if this is being released at the correct time, I should have one more week in Scandinavia, and then I'll be able to come back and do a few more things to celebrate reaching 500,000 subscribers. So until that point, thank you very much. Obviously, keep an eye out for more videos, and see you again in another one.